Get her off this plane. Right now. The command exploded through the first-class cabin with such force that conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned in unison. Coffee cups froze halfway to waiting lips. Even the quiet hum of the aircraft seemed to disappear beneath the weight of those 7 words. At 7:42 a.m., aboard Flight 218 bound for New York, 2 airport security officers stepped into the aisle with deliberate confidence, their dark uniforms cutting through the elegant cabin like storm clouds rolling across a clear sky. Their destination was unmistakable. A black woman sitting quietly in seat 2A. Naomi Brooks didn't flinch. She remained seated, one hand resting on a worn leather backpack tucked neatly beneath the seat in front of her. She wore faded blue jeans, white sneakers, and a plain charcoal sweater. No designer handbag. No expensive jewelry. No entourage announcing importance before she ever spoke. To everyone watching, she looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong section of the airplane. The lead flight attendant folded her arms. "Ma'am," she said loudly enough for half the cabin to hear, "you've been instructed multiple times to leave this seat." Naomi slowly raised her eyes. "I purchased this seat." "No," another crew member replied before she could continue. "You occupied this seat." The distinction landed harder than either of them realized. Across the aisle, a middle-aged white businessman adjusted his tailored jacket and let out an impatient sigh. This is exactly why flights are always delayed. A woman beside him nodded without hesitation. "If she doesn't belong in first class, just move her." The words floated through the cabin like permission. Permission to judge. Permission to assume. Permission to decide who belonged before learning a single fact. Naomi looked around the cabin, not with anger, but with a familiarity that hurt far more. She had seen these expressions before. The polite suspicion. The rehearsed smiles that disappeared the moment assumptions took over. The certainty that confidence somehow became suspicious when carried by someone who looked like her. Near the galley, a young trainee flight attendant named Emily Carter glanced nervously between the passenger manifest on her tablet and Naomi's boarding information. Something wasn't right. She frowned. The name matched. Seat 2A. Priority boarding. Everything appeared perfectly valid. Emily took one cautious step toward the senior attendant. "I think we already handled it," the senior attendant interrupted sharply without looking at her. Emily stopped talking. Not because she believed them. Because she was the newest employee on the crew. Back near the front of the cabin, one of the security officers stepped closer. "Ma'am, stand up." Naomi's voice remained calm. "I haven't violated any regulation." The officer's jaw tightened. "You are refusing crew instructions. I am asking for an explanation." "You've already received one." "No," Naomi answered softly. "I've received assumptions." Silence settled across the cabin. For just a heartbeat. Then someone in the back lifted a phone. Another passenger followed. Tiny glowing screens began appearing one after another, like stars emerging before a storm. The lead attendant noticed immediately. "No recording," she snapped. Several passengers lowered their phones. Others didn't. A little girl sitting beside the window looked up at her father and whispered, "Daddy, why are they mad at her?" The father hesitated. He searched for an answer that never came. Because there wasn't one. There was only discomfort. The kind that filled a room whenever prejudice tried to disguise itself as policy. One security officer reached toward Naomi's arm. His fingers had barely brushed her sleeve before the cabin seemed to stop breathing. Naomi slowly stood. Not because she was surrendering. Not because she was afraid. But because she understood something every person around her did not. The next 60 seconds would determine far more than whether she stayed on this airplane. They would determine the future of everyone who had just decided she didn't belong. 10 minutes earlier, nothing about Naomi Brooks demanded attention. That was precisely the point. At 7:32 a.m., Terminal B was alive with the familiar rhythm of departure. Rolling suitcases clicked across polished floors. Boarding. Announcements echoed from ceiling speakers. Travelers hurried past coffee stands, eyes fixed on departure boards instead of one another. Naomi walked through the crowd as though she were simply another passenger trying to make an early morning flight. She carried a weathered leather backpack over one shoulder. No luxury luggage. No designer sunglasses. No assistant walking a step behind her. She wore faded jeans, white sneakers, and a charcoal sweater that looked comfortable rather than expensive. Her hair was tied neatly behind her head, and the only thing she carried in her hand was a boarding pass folded once down the middle. No one looked twice. That, too, was intentional. 3 months earlier, dozens of anonymous complaints had landed on the desk of Brooks Global Holdings, the investment group Naomi had spent 22 years building from a single real estate office into one of America's largest transportation investors. One company appeared in those reports more than any other: Skirich Airlines. The complaints weren't about delayed flights. They weren't about lost luggage. They all described something far more difficult to measure. Passengers claimed they had been judged before they had spoken, questioned before they had answered, humiliated because of how they looked. Most of those complaints came from Black travelers. Some came from veterans. Others came from doctors, lawyers, professors, and business owners. Different people. The same pattern. Naomi had read every report herself. She never liked making decisions from conference rooms. Numbers explained performance. People explained truth. Which was why she booked today's flight using her legal name, paid for the ticket herself, declined executive notification, and instructed every member of her own office to remain silent. No special treatment. No advance warning. Only reality. She wanted to see the airline exactly as ordinary passengers experienced it. At Gate B-17, boarding had just begun. A gate agent scanned Naomi's boarding pass. The scanner flashed green. "Have a wonderful flight." Naomi smiled. "You too." Nothing unusual. Nothing memorable. She stepped onto the jet bridge with dozens of other passengers, disappearing into the steady stream of travelers. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin felt quiet and refined. Soft lighting reflected across polished surfaces. Fresh coffee filled the air. The kind of atmosphere designed to make people feel important before the airplane had even left the ground. Naomi found seat 2A without hesitation. She placed her backpack beneath the seat, fastened her seatbelt, and opened a slim notebook instead of a laptop. She wasn't preparing a presentation. She was observing. Every greeting, every smile, every interaction. Across the aisle, a white couple in expensive travel jackets noticed her almost immediately. The husband leaned slightly toward his wife. "I thought first class had a dress code." His voice was low, not low enough. The wife glanced toward Naomi before looking away. "Maybe she's upgrading with points." They laughed softly. Naomi kept reading. She had learned years ago that silence often invited people to reveal more about themselves than arguments ever could. Near the front galley, senior flight attendant Nicole Lawson looked toward seat 2A. Her smile faded almost instantly. She glanced at Naomi, then at the passenger manifest, then back again. Something about the woman sitting quietly by the window didn't fit the picture she had already created in her mind. Nicole called another crew member over. Their conversation lasted only a few seconds. Both looked toward Naomi. Neither smiled. At the rear of the cabin, trainee flight attendant Emily Carter noticed the exchange. She checked her own tablet. Seat 2A. Naomi Brooks. Priority boarding confirmed. Everything matched. Emily looked toward her supervisor, ready to mention it. But before she could take a single step, Nicole had already started walking down the aisle. And with every measured step she took toward seat 2A, an ordinary morning flight drifted one step closer to becoming a story that no one on board would ever forget. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one final time to move." Nicole Lawson's voice was calm on the surface, but underneath it carried something colder than authority. It carried certainty. The certainty that she had already decided who Naomi Brooks was. Naomi slowly closed the notebook resting on her lap. Around her, conversations faded into whispers. Passengers sensed the shift before anyone raised their voice. The cabin no longer felt like a place preparing for departure. It felt like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. "I'm sitting in the seat printed on my boarding pass," Naomi replied. Nicole didn't even ask to see it. "That won't be necessary." Those 4 words caught Emily Carter's attention immediately. The trainee flight attendant looked down at her tablet again. Every detail remained exactly the same. Passenger, Naomi Brooks. Seat, 2A. Priority boarding confirmed. There was no warning. No seating conflict. No reassignment. Emily swallowed. "Nicole." She began carefully. "The system's still. I said we've handled it." The answer came without Nicole ever turning around. Emily fell silent. Across the aisle, the businessman who had been watching from the beginning shook his head with exaggerated frustration. "If she's refusing instructions," he said loudly, Then call security. His wife folded her magazine. Exactly. Rules are rules. A man too rose behind joined in. People think they can get away with anything these days. No one asked what Naomi had actually done. No one asked whether the crew had made a mistake. Assumptions spread faster than facts. Nicole finally extended her hand. Your boarding pass. Naomi handed it over without hesitation. Nicole glanced at it for barely a second before folding it in half. This document is no longer valid. Emily's eyes widened. It hasn't been voided, she whispered almost to herself. Nicole ignored her. Instead, she stepped into the aisle and spoke into the cabin phone. Captain, we have a non-compliant passenger in first class. The words traveled through the aircraft like smoke. Non-compliant. Not confused. Not questioned. Not misunderstood. Just labeled. Within moments, the first officer emerged from the cockpit. Captain Daniel Harper followed a few steps behind. He looked at Naomi, then at Nicole, then back again. What seems to be the issue? Nicole answered before Naomi could open her mouth. She refuses to comply with crew instructions. Daniel nodded once. Ma'am, we'd appreciate your cooperation. Naomi met his eyes. I would appreciate an explanation. You've already been given one. No. Her voice never rose. I've been given an order. Silence. Daniel's expression hardened slightly. The crew has discretion regarding cabin safety. Naomi tilted her head. What safety concern have I created? No answer came. Instead, Daniel glanced toward Nicole, who simply folded her arms tighter. The absence of an answer was answer enough. Near the galley, Emily felt her stomach tighten. She had completed months of training. Conflict resolution. Passenger safety. Federal procedures. None of them had taught her this. Because this wasn't procedure. This was perception. She quietly approached another senior flight attendant. I think they're making a mistake. The woman barely looked up. Stay out of it. But her ticket is valid. So was mine when I started here. Emily frowned. What does that mean? It means you'll learn not to question supervisors. Back in the cabin, another passenger slowly raised his phone. Then another. A young college student sitting near row 3 whispered, "This doesn't feel right." His friend nodded. They haven't shown any proof. Nicole immediately noticed the cameras. No recording on board. Some lowered their phones. Others kept filming from waist level. One elderly black woman quietly shook her head. I've lived long enough to know this look, she murmured. Naomi heard her. Their eyes met for only a second. No words followed. None were necessary. They both recognized something older than this airplane. Older than this airline. A pattern. Then the cockpit door opened once more. This time, 2 airport security officers stepped aboard. Heavy boots echoed against the narrow aisle. The sound alone drained every remaining conversation from the cabin. Nicole stepped aside and pointed directly toward Naomi. That's her. The officers looked at Naomi for less than 3 seconds before walking forward. They hadn't heard her story. They hadn't checked the passenger manifest. They hadn't asked a single question. Sometimes prejudice didn't need evidence. Sometimes all it needed was someone willing to point. The taller security officer stopped only a few feet from Naomi. My name is Officer Grant, he said. Ma'am, we're going to ask you to come with us. Naomi looked up calmly. May I ask why? Grant hesitated for the briefest moment before repeating the only explanation he had been given. You've refused instructions from the flight crew. I asked for an explanation. You can discuss that outside the aircraft. Naomi folded her hands together. I'd prefer to discuss it here, where everyone has watched this unfold. The cabin became impossibly quiet. Passengers who had been eager to watch the confrontation now seemed uncomfortable becoming witnesses. Officer Grant shifted his weight. He wasn't an angry man. He was simply following a version of the story someone else had handed him. The second officer, Melissa Turner, studied Naomi's face for a moment. There was no panic, no shouting, no threats, no resistance. Nothing about the woman before her matched the image she'd been expecting when dispatch described a disruptive passenger. Behind them, Nicole Lawson crossed her arms impatiently. She's delaying the flight. Captain Daniel Harper nodded in agreement. We have over 100 passengers waiting. Naomi looked around the cabin. Then perhaps someone should explain why. No one answered. Instead, the silence began to work against the people who had created it. Emily Carter couldn't stay quiet anymore. She stepped forward. Captain. Every head turned toward the youngest member of the crew. I checked the manifest twice. Nicole shot her a warning glance. Emily, the passenger's ticket is valid. Another pause. Seat 2A belongs to Ms. Brooks. Nicole's expression hardened. This isn't about the seat. Emily frowned. Then what is it about? The question hung in the air. No one rushed to answer because every possible answer sounded worse than the one before it. The businessman across the aisle suddenly looked less confident than he had only minutes earlier. His wife quietly lowered her eyes to her lap. Even the passengers recording with their phones stopped whispering. Something had changed. Not because anyone knew who Naomi Brooks was, but because someone inside the system had finally admitted the facts didn't match the accusations. Officer Melissa looked toward Captain Harper. Captain, has anyone verified the complaint independently? Daniel hesitated. Nicole answered instead. My senior crew made the assessment. Melissa asked another question. Did she threaten anyone? No. Use abusive language? No. Refuse to present identification? Nicole's jaw tightened. No. Melissa looked back at Naomi. Did she become physically aggressive? Again, no. Every answer chipped away at the picture painted only moments before. Emily quietly opened the passenger record again. Her eyes froze. There was an additional notation she hadn't noticed earlier. Restricted. Executive services. Authorization level 7. Access locked. She tapped the screen. The file refused to open. That had never happened before. Her heartbeat quickened. She glanced toward Naomi. For the first time since boarding, Naomi noticed Emily's expression. The young flight attendant wasn't afraid anymore. She was confused. And confusion was often the first crack in certainty. An elderly black woman sitting in row 4 smiled gently at Emily. Keep asking questions, sweetheart. Emily nodded almost without realizing it. Officer Grant removed his radio from his shoulder. He spoke quietly into it. Dispatch. Can you verify passenger identification before removal? Nicole immediately stepped closer. Officer, that's unnecessary. Grant looked at her. It takes less than a minute. The aircraft needs to depart. So does the truth. Nicole blinked. She clearly hadn't expected resistance from the very officer she had called. Around the cabin, more phones slowly rose into view. This time no one lowered them. The atmosphere had shifted. People were no longer recording a difficult passenger. They were documenting an uncertain decision. Naomi remained standing beside her seat, perfectly composed. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't celebrating. She simply waited, because she had spent her entire life learning that truth never needed to rush. It only needed one person willing to stop pretending they already knew. Officer Grant's radio suddenly crackled. A dispatcher responded. Stand by. We're pulling passenger records now. For the first time that morning, Nicole Lawson looked genuinely nervous. The dispatcher never finished the sentence. Officer Grant's radio crackled once, then fell silent. He frowned and pressed the transmit button again. Dispatch. Nothing. A second later, the channel switched. This is operations. Hold your position. Grant exchanged a quick glance with Officer Melissa Turner. Neither of them had ever heard operations interrupt a routine passenger removal. The cabin grew still. Nicole Lawson forced a smile that looked more strained than reassuring. There must be some confusion. Naomi didn't respond. She simply stood beside seat 2A, her backpack resting where she had placed it when she first boarded. Untouched, just like her composure. Grant lowered the radio. Ma'am, until we receive further instructions, nobody is leaving this aircraft. Nicole stared at him. What? We've been told to hold. Captain Daniel Harper stepped forward. This flight is already behind schedule. Grant kept his eyes on the radio. I understand, Captain. No, I don't think you do. Daniel's frustration was beginning to show. We have over 100 passengers waiting because one passenger refuses to cooperate. Naomi finally spoke. No, Captain. Her voice remained almost impossibly gentle. They're waiting because no one has explained what I've done. Again, no answer. Only silence. The kind of silence that becomes heavier every second it remains unbroken. Emily looked down at the restricted file still displayed on her tablet. She tried once more. Access denied. She had never seen an ordinary passenger profile protected by executive-level encryption. It made no sense. Unless her thoughts were interrupted by a memory. During orientation, instructors had spent one afternoon discussing anonymous executive travel. Major investors, corporate auditors, government officials, Individuals whose identities were intentionally concealed until absolutely necessary. Most employees would never encounter one. Emily slowly looked back at Naomi. Could she be? No. Someone dressed this simply? Someone carrying an old backpack? Her own assumptions embarrassed her before she even finished the thought. Across the cabin, the elderly woman who had spoken earlier watched Naomi with quiet understanding. You remind me of my husband, she said softly. Naomi smiled politely. How so? He always said dignity is easiest to recognize after someone tries to take it away. Naomi's expression softened. He was a wise man. He had to be. The woman smiled sadly. He was a black judge in Mississippi during the 70s. A few nearby passengers overheard the conversation. The businessman who had demanded security now looked away completely. His confidence had disappeared. The certainty that filled the cabin 20 minutes earlier had begun to collapse under the weight of unanswered questions. Officer Melissa quietly stepped closer to Naomi. May I ask you something? Of course. Why haven't you argued with anyone? Naomi considered the question for a moment. Then she answered, because people reveal more when they believe they've already won. Melissa didn't know how to respond. The sentence lingered in her mind long after Naomi stopped speaking. At the front of the aircraft, Captain Harper received a message on the cockpit tablet. His eyes narrowed. He read it twice. Then a third time. Nicole noticed immediately. What is it? Daniel hesitated. It's asking us not to depart. For how long? It doesn't say. Nicole's face lost what little color remained. This is ridiculous. No. Daniel looked toward the screen again. This request came from corporate operations. Nicole blinked. Corporate. Highest priority. Nobody spoke. Corporate operations almost never intervened before a flight even left the gate. Certainly not over a single passenger. Emily felt her pulse racing. Restricted passenger file. Executive authorization. Operations stepping in. Corporate freezing the aircraft. The pieces refused to stay separate anymore. They were forming a picture. She just couldn't see it clearly yet. Naomi quietly reached into her backpack. Officer Grant instinctively tensed. She slowly removed a small leather notebook. Nothing else. She opened it to a page already marked with a ribbon. There, in neat handwriting, was a single sentence. She read it silently before closing the notebook once again. Not because she needed the reminder. Because she had written those words years ago after another day when someone had mistaken appearance for worth. She had promised herself that the next time it happened, she would never answer anger with anger. She would answer it with truth. Outside the aircraft windows, the morning sun climbed higher over the runway. Inside the cabin, every minute of delay made the mystery deeper. And somewhere beyond the boarding gate, a phone had just begun to ring. The ringing stopped. Somewhere beyond gate B-17, someone had answered. No one inside the aircraft knew who it was. But everyone could feel that something invisible had begun to move. Captain Daniel Harper stared at the cockpit display as another message appeared. Remain at gate. Executive authorization pending. He had flown for 26 years. He had never received a message with that classification before. Nicole Lawson leaned closer. What does it mean? I don't know. Then call operations. I already did. And Daniel looked up slowly. They told me to wait. Nicole's patience finally cracked. This is absurd. No, Naomi said quietly. This is simply what happens when facts arrive after assumptions. Nicole turned toward her. You seem remarkably calm. Naomi met her eyes. I've had a lot of practice. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The distance between them was only a few feet. Yet it felt as though they stood on opposite sides of something much larger than an airplane aisle. Officer Grant's radio buzzed again. Officer Grant. A voice replied. Stand by. A representative has requested direct communication with the passenger. Grant frowned. The passenger? Affirmative. He looked toward Naomi. They're asking for you. Naomi nodded politely. Thank you. She reached into the pocket of her sweater and removed a simple black smartphone. No gold case. No luxury brand. No visible sign that it was any different from millions of others. She unlocked it, scrolled once, then selected a single contact. No hesitation. No searching. As though she had always known this moment might come. The call connected almost instantly. Good morning, Evelyn. Her voice remained soft. There was no anger. No urgency. Only quiet certainty. Yes. She listened for a few seconds. I'm still on board. Another pause. No. Everything is proceeding exactly as expected. Emily's eyes widened. Expected? Nicole overheard the word as well. What does she mean, expected? Nobody answered. Naomi continued speaking. Please initiate stage 1. Silence. Then she smiled faintly. Thank you. The call ended. It had lasted less than 30 seconds. Nothing more. No threats. No raised voice. No mention of lawyers. No demand for names. Just one calm conversation. Officer Melissa looked at Grant. What was stage 1? Grant slowly shook his head. I don't think we're supposed to know. Across the cabin, passengers exchanged nervous glances. The businessman who had demanded security now looked toward the aircraft door every few seconds, as though he suddenly wanted to leave more than anyone else. Emily couldn't stop replaying Naomi's words. Everything is proceeding exactly as expected. Those weren't the words of someone caught by surprise. Those were the words of someone watching a plan unfold. Captain Harper's tablet chimed again. This time, the notification carried a bright red banner. Do not depart. Executive Response Team en route. ETA, for minutes. Daniel felt his mouth go dry. Executive Response Team? That division never handled ordinary passenger complaints. It existed for only the most sensitive corporate matters. Nicole stepped closer. What now? Daniel looked directly at her. I think we're no longer in charge. The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. The authority that had controlled the cabin all morning suddenly felt fragile. Emily looked back at Naomi. She was no longer reading. No longer writing. She simply watched the morning sunlight spill across the cabin floor. Composed, patient, almost reflective. The elderly woman in row 4 smiled. I think you've been here before. Naomi returned the smile. Not on this airplane, but somewhere. Naomi nodded once. More times than I can count. The woman reached across the aisle and gently touched Naomi's hand. I'm sorry. Naomi squeezed her fingers lightly. Don't be. What happened today didn't begin today. The words settled over the cabin like a quiet confession. Not spoken with bitterness. Spoken with understanding. Outside the aircraft windows, 3 black SUVs rolled across the restricted service road toward the gate. No flashing lights. No sirens. Just steady purpose. Officer Grant noticed them first. Then Captain Harper. Then Nicole. None of them recognized the vehicles. But every instinct told them they hadn't come for a delayed flight. They had come because of the woman everyone had decided did not belong in seat 2A. No one spoke as the aircraft door opened. The silence itself had become intimidating. A man in a dark navy suit stepped aboard first, followed by a woman carrying a slim tablet and 2 additional executives wearing airport security credentials that looked nothing like the badges everyone else had seen that morning. None of them looked toward the captain. None of them acknowledged Nicole Lawson. Their eyes searched the cabin until they found Naomi Brooks standing quietly beside seat 2A. The man in the navy suit walked forward without hesitation. Then, in front of more than 100 stunned passengers, he stopped, straightened his jacket, and extended both hands. Ms. Brooks, he said respectfully, I sincerely apologize for making you wait. Every face in the cabin froze. Nicole blinked. Captain Harper stared in disbelief. Officer Grant lowered his radio. Naomi shook the man's hand. Good morning, Richard. I'm afraid it isn't, he answered. Not after what has happened here. Richard turned toward the captain. My name is Richard Hale. His voice remained professional. I am Executive Vice President of Skirich Airlines. The words landed like thunder. Nicole's confidence disappeared instantly. Richard continued. Captain Harper, please suspend all departure procedures. Daniel swallowed. Sir, may I ask why? You may. Richard looked directly at Naomi before answering. Because the passenger your crew attempted to remove is the chairwoman and chief executive officer of Brooks Global Holdings. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even the air inside the cabin felt different. Emily Carter covered her mouth. The businessman across the aisle slowly lowered his eyes. His wife looked as though she wanted to disappear into her seat. Richard continued speaking. Brooks Global Holdings finalized a multibillion-dollar investment agreement with Skirich less than 3 weeks ago. He paused, pending one final condition. Nicole whispered, almost to herself. What condition? Naomi answered. To see how your company treated people when it believed no one important was watching. The words were gentle, but they carried more weight than any accusation. Richard nodded. Ms. Brooks requested complete anonymity. No executive notification. No VIP services. No priority handling beyond the ticket she legally purchased. Only one objective. He slowly looked around the cabin. To experience this airline exactly as an ordinary passenger. Emily felt tears filling her eyes. Everything suddenly made sense. The restricted passenger file. Executive authorization. Corporate intervention. The mysterious phone call. It had never been about revealing power. It had been about revealing character. Richard accepted the tablet from the woman beside him. The entire interaction has already been preserved. He glanced briefly towards several passengers. We also appreciate those who documented today's events. A few people quietly lowered their phones. Not from fear, from embarrassment. Nicole finally found her voice. Sir, I didn't know. Naomi looked at her with remarkable calm. I know. Nicole frowned. You know? I know you didn't know my title. Naomi's expression never changed. But you believed you knew my value. The sentence echoed through the cabin. No one could escape it, because everyone knew exactly what she meant. Officer Melissa slowly removed her cap. I'm sorry. Naomi nodded respectfully. You asked questions before reaching conclusions. Melissa looked confused. I should have asked sooner. Perhaps. Naomi smiled gently. But you still asked. Then she turned toward Officer Grant. And thank you for waiting. Grant exhaled slowly. I almost didn't. But you did. Richard stepped beside Naomi once more. The board has already been informed. Captain Harper closed his eyes briefly. He understood. The flight delay no longer mattered. The passenger complaint no longer mattered. What mattered was that an entire cabin had just witnessed how quickly assumptions could become humiliation, and how a single calm phone call had exposed the truth no title ever should have been required to prove. The atmosphere inside the cabin changed without anyone raising their voice. Moments earlier, authority had belonged to uniforms. Now, it belonged to truth. Richard Hale turned to Captain Harper first. Captain, effective immediately, this aircraft will remain at the gate pending a formal review. Daniel nodded once. I understand. There was no argument left to make. The facts had already spoken. Richard then faced Officer Grant and Melissa Turner. I want to thank both of you for pausing the removal when questions began to surface. Grant lowered his head slightly. We should have asked those questions sooner. Perhaps, Richard replied. But you asked them before it was too late. Melissa glanced toward Naomi. I hope one day that's enough. Naomi offered a gentle smile. It's where accountability begins. Richard's expression hardened as he turned toward Nicole Lawson. Please surrender your company identification. Nicole stared at him. Here? Yes. In front of everyone? Richard didn't hesitate. The decisions that brought us here happened in front of everyone. Her hands trembled as she unclipped the identification badge from her uniform. The tiny piece of plastic suddenly felt heavier than it ever had before. Richard accepted it quietly. Pending the outcome of the investigation, you are relieved of duty. Nicole looked toward Naomi, searching for anger. She found none. That somehow made the moment even more painful. Captain Harper stepped forward. I accept responsibility for my decisions. Naomi nodded respectfully. Leadership always begins there. Daniel looked down. I chose convenience over verification. You chose assumptions over questions, Naomi corrected. Gently. And those are never the same thing. Emily Carter remained near the galley, unable to stop replaying every moment since boarding. If she had stayed silent, if Officer Grant had ignored the dispatcher, if passengers hadn't recorded what happened, how different would this morning have become? Richard noticed her. What is your name? Emily Carter, sir. You spoke when it wasn't easy. Emily swallowed. I almost didn't. But you did. Richard smiled. People like you protect organizations from becoming the worst versions of themselves. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Those words meant more than any promotion ever could. Across the cabin, the businessman slowly stood. He cleared his throat awkwardly. Ms. Brooks. Every passenger looked toward him. I owe you an apology. Naomi listened. I judged you before I knew anything about you. He shook his head. I wish I could say today was the first time I've done that. Naomi answered without hesitation. Then don't let it be the last time you recognize it. He nodded quietly before sitting back down. His wife reached for his hand. Neither of them spoke again. One by one, passengers lowered their phones. Not because the story was over, because they realized they had witnessed something much larger than an airline dispute. They had watched prejudice collapse under the weight of simple facts. Richard turned toward the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Skirich Airlines, I sincerely apologize." His voice carried through every row. "What happened today does not represent the standards we claim to uphold." He paused. "But it does reveal where we have failed." No one applauded. No one interrupted. Some moments deserve silence more than sound. Naomi picked up her weathered backpack. The same backpack that had convinced so many people she couldn't possibly belong in first class. She slipped one arm through the strap. Nothing about her appearance had changed. The jeans were still faded. The sneakers were still worn. The sweater was still simple. Only the assumptions around her had changed. As she prepared to leave the aircraft with Richard, Emily quietly called after her. "Ms. Brooks." Naomi turned. Emily hesitated. "What made you so certain that one phone call would change everything?" Naomi smiled softly. "It wasn't the phone call." Emily frowned. "It was the truth." She looked once around the cabin. The call simply gave the truth a chance to arrive. With those words, Naomi stepped toward the aircraft door. Behind her, an entire cabin remained seated in complete silence. Each person left alone with a single uncomfortable question. How many extraordinary people had they already overlooked, simply because they never looked beyond the surface? An hour later, Flight 218 finally departed. The engines roared. The runway blurred beneath the wings. Yet inside the aircraft, almost no one spoke. Some passengers stared out the windows. Others replayed the videos they had recorded, no longer seeing a confrontation between airline staff and a passenger. They saw something else now. A mirror. Naomi Brooks sat once again in seat 2A, the very seat she had been told she did not deserve. Nothing about her appearance had changed. Her faded jeans were still neatly pressed. Her charcoal sweater was still simple. Her weathered backpack still rested beneath the seat in front of her. The only difference was that now everyone understood what should have been obvious from the beginning. None of those things had ever measured her worth. Emily Carter walked quietly down the aisle before takeoff service began. She stopped beside Naomi. "I wanted to thank you." Naomi looked up with a warm smile. "For what?" "For showing me the difference between following instructions and following what's right." Naomi closed her notebook. "Never confuse authority with integrity." Emily nodded slowly. "I won't." As she walked away, those words stayed with her. Years later, she would still remember them every time she welcomed a passenger onto an airplane. At the front of the cabin, Captain Daniel Harper's announcement came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen." His voice carried a sincerity that had been missing earlier that morning. "Before we continue our flight, I would like to personally apologize for what occurred before departure." A pause. "We are trusted with people's safety. We must also be worthy of their dignity." No one applauded. The apology wasn't offered to earn forgiveness. It was offered because responsibility demanded it. Outside the window, the clouds stretched endlessly beneath the morning sun. Naomi looked at them quietly. For a brief moment, she remembered another flight many years earlier. She had been 21 years old, a college student carrying borrowed luggage. Someone had mistaken her for cabin cleaning staff before asking her to leave the premium boarding lane. Back then, she had cried alone in an airport restroom. Not because she doubted herself, because she wondered how long it would take before people looked past her skin. Today, she finally had the answer. Longer than it should, but not forever. She opened the worn leather notebook one last time. On the final page, beneath words she had written years ago, she added a single sentence. "Never let another person's assumptions become your identity." She closed the notebook and slipped it back into her backpack. The businessman across the aisle caught her eye. This time he smiled. Not the polite smile reserved for important people. The respectful smile offered to another human being. Naomi returned it. Because change rarely begins with grand speeches. Sometimes, it begins with one uncomfortable lesson honestly learned. As the aircraft climbed higher above the clouds, the sunlight filled every corner of the cabin. The same cabin where judgment had once arrived before truth. Now it carried something different. Perspective. Because titles can command respect. Money can buy influence. Power can change policies. But none of those things should ever be required before someone is treated with basic human dignity. Naomi rested her head against the window and watched the horizon brighten. Justice had not come because she was a CEO. Justice had come because the truth had finally been allowed to speak. And perhaps that was the lesson every person on Flight 218 would carry home. The next time they met someone whose clothes seemed too ordinary, whose skin looked different from their own, whose success wasn't immediately visible, they would pause before making a judgment, because the most extraordinary people often arrive without announcing themselves. And character has never needed a luxury suitcase, an expensive watch, or a prestigious title to deserve respect. It has only ever needed one thing: the chance to be seen before it is judged.